Welcome back to part 2 of our study of Genesis. We just ended with the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, being exiled from the Garden of Eden because of their sin. Now we continue to see that sin spreading throughout the world and infecting all of their descendants. So in Genesis 4 through 6, sin is growing and growing to the point that God decides He must destroy humanity with a flood. Now, why does God have to judge humanity's sin? Can't God, being God, just simply forgive them and just look the other way? No, God judges human sin because He is holy and He is righteous and He is good. If God was simply to permit sin to continue without judgment, He wouldn't be holy, righteous, and good. If God allowed sin to continue without judgment, He would actually become a partaker in the human sin. He would become an unrighteous and sinful God Himself. It's like the example of if a judge knows that this man has committed murder. All the evidence is against him. You've got eyewitnesses, you've got DNA. There's not a doubt in anyone's mind that this man heinously killed another human being. And yet the judge says, I'm a loving and forgiving judge. Therefore, I'm going to let you go. We would be outraged, wouldn't we? That judge has become an accomplice in the murder itself by allowing it to happen. There has been an injustice that has taken place. And now this judge has let this man walk the street without having to pay for his crime. That judge is not a just judge. He's an unrighteous judge. And so for God to remain a just and holy God, He must judge human sin. And yet in the story of the flood, we see that God is not only a God of judgment, He's also a God of mercy. God chooses a portion of humanity through this one man named Noah, this man who has obeyed God. He chooses Noah and reveals Himself to Noah and gives Noah a way of salvation from his judgment. He reveals to Noah that Noah is to build an ark. Noah doesn't invent the ark. God tells him exactly what to do. He tells him how big it's supposed to be. He gives him the measurements, and Noah does exactly what God tells him to do. And through this one obedient man named Noah, humanity is saved. A remnant of humanity is saved from the flood. And God then establishes a covenant with Noah. So God uses Noah to save humanity, and then He makes a covenant with Noah. So after Noah emerges from this flood with his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, after he emerges, God establishes a covenant, which is this formalized agreement, this formalized relationship that is between Noah as the representative of humanity and God. And God promises never to destroy humanity again with a flood until the end of history comes. So what the covenant with Noah does is it preserves the earth for the duration of God's plan of salvation. So because God has made this agreement, now He is going to be patient with humanity until He gives His full plan of salvation. The plan of salvation with Noah was just a picture of the greater salvation that would come in the future. That God would bring an obedient man who would, through his obedience, others would be brought through the judgment safely. And of course, that is Jesus Christ. But the covenant with Noah, it creates a atmosphere in which God is now going to bring about this plan of salvation with Jesus Christ. There's going to be regular rain and harvest. There's going to be the regular rhythms of life, and we don't have to worry about a sudden cataclysmic destruction of all of humanity that's going to prevent God's plan of salvation from coming about. That's now being pushed to the end of history when the final judgment comes. So we see Noah emerging from the flood, and yet we see Noah still being a sinner. There's this strange story about Noah getting drunk, and this strange story about that in Genesis chapter 9. But the main point of that story is simply to clarify that even though Noah was an obedient man, he's still a sinful man. He is just like Adam. He's inherited Adam's sinful nature. So while the flood destroyed many sinners, the flood did not destroy sin. God still is going to have to deal with sin itself. And therefore, God chooses a man named Abraham and makes a covenant with him. Noah has all these descendants through his 3 sons. All of us come from those 3 sons, and their descendants are spread out throughout the world. And of course, that happens forcibly because they initially wanted to stay together and try to make a name for themselves instead of make a name for God. They try to make a name for themselves by building this tower at Babel, but God scatters them in order to preserve humanity for his future salvation. And so God chooses Abraham, and he makes a covenant with Abraham. And the covenant is the covenant of bringing about a kingdom. He promises Abraham that Abraham is going to have a family. He's going to have descendants. He's going to be made into a nation. He's going to have a place. He's going to have a land. And he's going to have a great name. And the great name is that God is actually going to identify himself with Abraham so that the name of God himself is going to be identified with Abraham. Abraham's going to, or God is going to become the God of Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God is promising a people in a place with a covenant relationship with God. God is promising this kingdom that's going to come about through Abraham. He guarantees this promise in Genesis 15 through the shedding of blood, as Abraham is instructed to kill all these animals. And then Abraham does not walk between the midst of this bloody path of the animals. It is God's presence that symbolically goes between those animal pieces, showing that God himself has taken on all the promises of this covenant. He himself is going to bring it about. And we see that most vividly in the promise of descendants. God is the one who miraculously gives Abraham and his wife Sarai, or later Sarah, a son in Isaac. When they were beyond the years of childbearing, God does what only God can do, showing that God is going to fulfill all the promises himself. Even though the people of God are going to fail, even though the people of God are going to sin, God in his grace and his mercy is going to fulfill his plan. We, of course, see that repeatedly in the lives of Isaac, in the lives of Jacob. There are many things that God does to preserve his people, but most vividly, we see that in this story at the end of the book of Genesis, which is the story of Joseph, where God uses Joseph to save Israel. So Abraham's family only survived and grew because of God's providential, loving care for them. God protected them, and God never abandons his people, even though they aren't always who they should be. They make mistakes. They even deliberately sin. I mean, Jacob's very name is deceiver. That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. All the deception of Jacob is a bad thing, but God even uses those things in his plan to bring about the salvation that's going to come. So the story of Joseph especially shows how God's power is at work to care for Abraham's family. So we see at the beginning of that story that there is a sin of favoritism, where Jacob loves Joseph more than all of his other children because he's the firstborn of the wife he loves, Rachel. Therefore, this culminates in Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, saying that he is dead, and all these horrible things happening to Joseph because of the sin of favoritism in the family. And yet God has allowed these things and ordained these things to take place because he has a greater purpose for his people. He puts Joseph in Egypt, and then Joseph's falsely accused. He goes to even lower spot, prison. And yet God prospers Joseph even in prison and then elevates him through the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams to the second in command of all of Egypt, so that Joseph is at the right place when a famine comes. And he's the one who prepares Egypt for this famine so that the nation of Israel in particular, his brothers and their children and his father, can be saved through what Joseph is doing. And this is all summed up at the end of the story of Joseph in Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph says to his brothers, "You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." So even when man has sinned against God, and they're in rebellion against God, and even when those that God has singled out to use through a covenant relationship to bring his covenant about sin and are marked with all these sinful stories that we read about in Genesis, God remains the creator and the king of everything. Even though sin entered the world, God remains in control. And he is in such complete control that when someone plans evil, like Joseph's brothers, God plans good. You'll notice that the verb in Genesis 50, verse 20 is the same both for humans and for God. Humans planned evil, God planned good. And so it's not that humans planned evil and did evil, but God changed it to good or transformed it to good. That in the same events that were happening, there were two different planners with two different intentions. So God planned for Joseph to suffer. And yet God's intention in that suffering was for good, while the intention of the human beings, Joseph's brother, was for evil. And so what we see here is that in his wisdom, God is always choosing what is best for us, even when that best thing is our suffering. And he is using even our suffering and even human sin to bring glory to himself and bring about the good of his people. And what a fantastic message to end the book of Genesis on. That we as God's people can absolutely trust God in every situation and every circumstance. And so I want to end here with helping us to see Jesus in this book, which there's so many different ways we can see Jesus. But the way I want to highlight for us today is through Genesis as a genealogy. You know, there are so many genealogies in the book of Genesis. This person begat this person. This person begat this person. And it can become boring reading all these difficult names and how old they were and that kind of thing. But it's not just that Genesis is containing genealogies, but that Genesis itself is kind of an extended genealogy where there are stories about certain people, but the whole point is to trace a family line from creation and Adam all the way to Jacob and his descendants. And why is it? Why is Moses, when he's writing this book down, interested in this genealogy? It goes back to that promise in Genesis 3:15, that it is the seed of the woman that will destroy the work of the serpent and bring about salvation. So the hope of humanity is in a family line, in a seed, a descendant that's going to come from the man and the woman. So Genesis is constantly pointing us forward to looking for this seed and then narrowing down that now that there's a large So Genesis is constantly pointing us to this and narrowing it down so that we know, okay, the seed of the woman, it's going to come through Abraham. And the seed of the woman, it's going to come through Isaac, not Ishmael. And it's going to come through Jacob, not Esau. And even at the end of the book, the blessing is put upon Judah. The ruler is going to come through Judah. And it's going to come that through this family and this nation, the nation of Israel, the family of Abraham, God is going to save his creation. God is going to save all of humanity. And that's where the New Testament picks it up, right? It picks it up in Matthew with another genealogy, that this one being born, this Jesus who's born in Bethlehem, he comes from David, he comes from Abraham. And in the book of Luke, in Luke chapter 3, he even comes all the way back to Adam. That in Jesus, we're finally seeing the descendant, the seed of Abraham, the seed of the woman. And it's through him that all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. It's through him that creation is going to be restored. It's through him that the kingdom of God is coming.